It was the 16th of November, 1957. In Plainfield, Wisconsin, the air had gone brittle the way it always does before a hard Midwestern winter, dry, still, the kind of cold that gets into your coat and stays there. Frank Wardens was a hardware store owner's son, and when he came to help close up the family's shop that evening, he noticed the till was open and his mother, Bernice, was gone. Just gone. And there was blood on the floor. The last person seen with Bernice Wardens, the sheriff's department quickly learned, was Ed Gein. A neighbor. A handyman. A quiet, unremarkable bachelor who had lived alone on the family farm for a decade since his mother died. The locals knew him. The kids thought he was odd but harmless. He sometimes babysat children in the neighborhood. When officers arrived at the Gein farm that night, they found Bernice Wardens hanging from the rafters of the summer kitchen, gutted and beheaded, dressed out like a deer. What they found beyond that would take weeks to fully catalog, months to fully comprehend, and in some ways, a lifetime to fully reckon with. He wasn't a monster that crept out of the dark. He was the man next door. That's the part that never stopped being terrifying. Said Washara, county investigator. This is the story of Edward Theodore Gein, not merely as a footnote in the annals of American crime, but as a human being whose unraveling raises questions we are still asking today. What creates a man like this? What does it mean that no one saw it coming? And what does our ongoing fascination with him say about us? Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, the second son of George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmina Gein, née Lurk. To understand Ed Gein, you must first understand Augusta. Because in many ways, there was no Ed Gein separate from her. Augusta was a woman of profound and rigid religiosity. She was devout in the manner of someone who uses piety as a weapon, a Lutheran fundamentalist who believed the world outside their home was a swirling cesspool of sin, temptation, and moral corruption. She believed in the literal word of the Old Testament, and she read it aloud to her children every single day. The book of Proverbs. Passages from Psalms. But more often the punishing, judgmental verses, the wages of sin, the corruption of the flesh, the wrath of God. George Gein, by contrast, was a diminished man. A drifter by temperament, he worked a series of failing jobs, a grocery store that went under, various labor gigs around La Crosse, while Augusta barely concealed her contempt for him. She considered him weak. She may have been right, in the narrow sense that George drank and failed to provide in the ways Augusta demanded. But Augusta's contempt extended further than George. It extended to all men. She made no secret of this to her sons. Women, Augusta taught Ed and his older brother Henry, were to be either saints or whores. All women outside of herself fell into the latter category. Sex was a vehicle of degradation. Friendship with outsiders led to ruin. The world beyond the farm was poison. When the family moved in 1913 to a 195-acre farm outside Plainfield, an isolated, self-sufficient spread in the central Wisconsin countryside, Augusta made sure the isolation was total. Ed and Henry were not permitted to bring friends home. They were barely permitted to have them. School was the only window to the outside world, and Ed by all accounts was a poor fit for it, not unintelligent, but passive, strange, and prone to what teachers described as inexplicable fits of laughter. He had very few friends. One classmate recalled that he smelled of the farm and always seemed to be somewhere else even when he was sitting right in front of you. What did Ed Gein want, underneath all of it? That question is harder to answer than it seems. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, obviously angry or overtly menacing. He was mild. He smiled easily, laughed at things other people didn't laugh at. He was a diligent worker on the farm, obedient to his mother in a way that went far beyond what most people would consider normal filial devotion. Augusta was his entire world, and she had engineered it that way deliberately. Augusta didn't raise a son. She raised a satellite, something that could only exist in orbit around her. Henry Gein, the older brother, was the more assertive of the two. He had a quiet rebelliousness Augusta could not quite stamp out. He began, in his adult years, to gently push back, to suggest, heretically, that Augusta was not entirely right about everything. That Ed might benefit from getting out into the world. That their mother was, in fact, not the center of the universe. On May 16, 1944, Henry and Ed were fighting a brush fire on the farm. When the fire was extinguished, Henry was dead. The official cause was listed as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. Ed reported finding the body. There were bruises on Henry's head, though investigators at the time noted them and moved on. No charges were ever filed. Ed was 37 years old. He was now alone with his mother. And for the first time, he seemed truly content. The year after Henry's death was, in every outward observable way, ordinary. Ed maintained the farm. He ran small errands in Plainfield. He was friendly enough to neighbors in the way of rural Wisconsin men who keep to themselves but will fix your fence if you ask. Augusta continued to run the household with iron authority, continued to deliver her nightly scripture readings, and continued to describe the world beyond their property as an open grave. But Augusta's health was failing. She had suffered a stroke in 1944, and a second one the following year left her partially paralyzed. Ed became her full-time caretaker, feeding her, bathing her, managing the farm, nursing her through the indignities of physical decline. By all accounts he did this without complaint, without impatience. He did it with what neighbors who saw him briefly described as something close to devotion. Augusta Gein died on December 29, 1945. Ed was 39 years old. He had never had a real romantic relationship. He had never lived outside the farm. He had never, in any meaningful sense, had a self that was not defined in relation to his mother. And now she was gone. What happens to a psyche constructed entirely around a single other person when that person disappears? Psychiatrists who later examined Gein would return to this question again and again. The answer they arrived at was not a clean or simple one. Ed Gein did not simply grieve. He did not begin to heal or to slowly construct a new self in the absence of the old anchor. Instead, he sealed Augusta's rooms, her bedroom, her sitting room, and left them exactly as she had left them. Untouched. A shrine. A mausoleum. He continued to live in the kitchen and one other small room. The rest of the house became Augusta's monument. He didn't lose his mother. He lost his entire personality. Everything he was, she had authored. The farm was no longer profitable, it hadn't been for years, and Ed survived on government subsidies and occasional odd jobs for neighbors. He fixed things. He did yard work. He was, by every available account, unremarkable in public. He told stories. He was considered, strange as this is to write, good with children. Parents would hire him to babysit. He showed up. He read books to the kids. He was gentle with them. Whatever was beginning to form in the interior of Ed Gein's mind during these years after Augusta's death, it left no trace on his surface. That disjunction, between the quiet exterior and the catastrophic interior, is perhaps the most unsettling thing about him. Ed Gein read voraciously. This detail tends to get lost in the lurid catalogue of what he eventually did, but it matters enormously for understanding him. In the absence of his mother, he turned to books with something approaching hunger. And the books he chose reveal the contours of his private obsessions with unsettling clarity. He read true crime. He read pulp detective magazines. He read accounts of Nazi atrocities, the medical experiments, the mass graves, the bureaucratic machinery of death, with what he later described to investigators as a kind of horrified fascination. He read about South Sea headhunters. He read about cannibalism in the context of anthropological texts. He read about the practices of indigenous burial and the preparation of the dead. He also became fascinated with anatomy. He had no formal training, but he acquired enough self-taught knowledge of the human body that later investigators and forensic examiners would note, with grim admiration, the technical skill evident in certain aspects of what they found at the farm. Gein later told psychiatrists that around this time, the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, he began experiencing what he described as desires he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. He was drawn to the idea of womanhood in a way that was not, he insisted, primarily sexual. It was something more total than that. He wanted, in some sense he could barely name, to become a woman. Specifically, he wanted to become his mother. This is where the grave robbing began. Gein later confessed to investigators that between approximately 1947 and 1952, he made at least a dozen trips to local cemeteries, primarily the Plainfield Cemetery and others nearby, and exhumed the bodies of recently buried middle-aged women. Women who reminded him, he said, of Augusta. He did not act alone on all of these occasions. A man named Gus, an older neighbor who shared some of Gein's morbid interests and was by all accounts himself deeply troubled, accompanied him on several of these trips. When Gus died in the early 1950s, Gein continued alone. He wasn't visiting the graves. He was trying to bring something back from them that had been taken from him. What did he do with what he exhumed? He began, in the isolation of the farmhouse, to construct objects. He made masks of preserved human facial skin. He made a vest, painstakingly assembled, complete with breasts, made from the skin of a woman's torso. He made soup bowls from skulls. He decorated bedposts with them. He crafted a lampshade and a wastebasket from human skin. He put on the vest and danced in the moonlight in the yard of the farm, by his own later account. He wanted to feel what it would be like to inhabit a woman's body. He was not psychotic in the clinical sense, he knew what he was doing was wrong, he knew the bodies were real. But the knowledge did not stop him. The compulsion had become its own logic, its own closed system. Through all of this, he remained, in Plainfield, the quiet handyman. The odd but harmless bachelor. The man who would babysit your kids. Investigators believe, and Gein himself, in fragmented and often contradictory confessions, suggested, that somewhere around 1954, the grave robbing was no longer sufficient. Exactly why this threshold was crossed is a question that admits no clean answer. Psychiatric literature on this type of escalation suggests a pattern familiar in predatory behavior. The original compulsion loses its power to satisfy and demands increasingly direct enactment. On November 9, 1954, a tavern owner named Mary Hogan disappeared from her bar in Pine Grove, Wisconsin. 51 years old, heavy-set, middle-aged. The bar was empty. There was blood on the floor and a trail of it leading to the parking lot. Nobody was found. The case went unsolved. Nobody connected it to Ed Gein. Why would they? He was 50 miles away in Plainfield, fixing fences and reading his magazines. 3 more years passed. On the surface, nothing changed. Gein maintained his routines. He appeared in town. He told his jokes. He babysat. He collected government subsidy checks and spent them on hardware and books. The farm continued its slow deterioration, the outbuildings sagging, the paint peeling from the siding, the yard collecting junk in that gradual way that happens when a man stops caring whether anyone is watching. Inside the farmhouse, the collection grew. Gein later confessed to killing a second woman before Bernice Worden's. The evidence gathered from the farm ultimately confirmed the presence of remains from at least 10 women, though the precise number of people Gein murdered, as opposed to exhumed, has never been definitively established. He gave inconsistent accounts. He sometimes claimed the graves, sometimes claimed he couldn't remember. Investigators believed he was capable of having committed more murders than he admitted to. The evidence was degraded by time and by his own macabre methods of preservation and use. The farmhouse was not a crime scene in the ordinary sense. It was something closer to an interior world made physical. Bernice Worden's was the owner of Worden's hardware store in Plainfield. 58 years old, a widow, a pillar of the small community. On the morning of November 16, 1957, Ed Gein walked into the hardware store. He had been there before, often. He knew Bernice. She knew him. He shot her with her own store's display rifle. He loaded her body into her own truck and drove her back to the farm. He hung her from the rafters of the summer kitchen and proceeded to dress her out, as one would a deer. By nightfall, investigators were standing in the kitchen of the Gein farmhouse, shining flashlights across a decade of secret accumulation. Skulls on bedposts. A refrigerator containing human organs. A heart in a paper bag. Noses. A belt made of female nipples. 4 noses on a string. The preserved faces, stretched over forms, arranged like masks in a theatrical wardrobe. One of the deputies who was there that night reportedly walked out of the farmhouse, sat down in the snow, and did not move for several minutes. He later told a colleague he simply needed to sit with the outside air for a while. Ed Gein was arrested at a neighbor's house later that same evening. He had been having dinner there, apparently unbothered, when the news about the hardware store reached the family. He was calm when deputies came for him. He did not resist. He seemed, by accounts, somewhat puzzled by the fuss. The first psychiatric evaluation was conducted at Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. What the examining psychiatrists found was not the slavering monster of pulp fiction but something considerably more confounding, a soft-spoken, cooperative, sometimes charming man who answered questions honestly and without apparent shame, but also without apparent remorse in the conventional sense. He was not indifferent to others' pain. He expressed distress about Bernice Worden's family. He just seemed to exist in a different moral universe, one in which the internal logic that governed his behavior had become so completely self-enclosed that external ethical categories had lost their grip. Diagnosis was contested and complicated. Examiners variously described him as schizophrenic, as having a severe personality disorder, as possessing elements of what would later be called gender dysphoria, though the clinical vocabulary of that era was cruder and often punitive. What was agreed upon universally was that he was not fit to stand trial. He was found legally insane and committed to the Central State Hospital without trial. He spent the next decade in institutional care. Guards and nurses who worked with him described a man who was a model patient-level cooperative. He helped with chores. He was polite. He was fond of small rituals. He was, again, good with the other patients. He read. He watched television when it became available. He watched, with what was reported as considerable interest, a documentary about wild animals. He wasn't performing normalcy in the hospital. He was, in that environment, genuinely at ease. That's the part nobody could explain. In 1968, 10 years after his commitment, psychiatrists at Central State determined that Gein was now competent to stand trial. He was 61 years old. The trial for Bernice Worden's murder took place in November of that year. The proceedings lasted about a week. On November 14, 1968, exactly 11 years after his arrest, the jury found Ed Gein guilty of first-degree murder. The judge immediately ordered a hearing on his mental status. The finding was the same as it had been in 1957, not guilty by reason of insanity. Gein was remanded back to institutional custody, this time at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison. Plainfield, Wisconsin, had a population of about 700 people in 1957. It was the kind of town where everyone knew the names not just of their neighbors but of their neighbors' dogs, their neighbors' fathers, the plots in the cemetery where 4 generations of family were buried. The revelation that Ed Gein had been systematically robbing that cemetery, that the bodies of people's mothers, grandmothers, wives were partially unaccounted for, opened a wound in the community that simple grief could not describe. Families went to the cemetery and stood at graves that had been disturbed. Some asked for exhumations to check. Some preferred not to know. The horror was not abstract. It was specific. It had names on headstones. In March 1958, the Gein farmhouse burned to the ground. The fire was ruled arson. No one was ever charged. No one in Plainfield seemed particularly inclined to investigate too vigorously. The ruins were later cleared and the land left empty. The spot remains empty today. Gein's car, a 1949 Ford sedan that he had used to transport bodies, was sold at auction and purchased by a carnival operator who charged 25 cents for people to sit in it. Thousands came. Something about the spectacle was consistent with a long American tradition of turning horror into entertainment, of metabolizing the unacceptable through the mechanism of the sideshow. The town itself never fully metabolized it. Decades later, longtime residents would describe a persistent reluctance to mention Gein by name, not out of reverence, but out of a desire not to be associated. Plainfield wanted to be known for other things. It never entirely got the chance. Small towns don't forget. They just learn to talk around the thing they can't forget. In the wider culture, the impact was seismic and lasting. Robert Bloch, a Wisconsin author who followed the case in the newspapers, was disturbed enough by it to write a novel, published in 1960, called Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock adapted it that same year. Norman Bates, the mild-mannered, mother-obsessed motel keeper who dresses in his dead mother's clothes and cannot quite separate himself from her psyche, is the most directly drawn portrait of Gein in popular fiction. But the influence didn't stop there. Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter drew on Gein's predilection for human materials as objects of craft and aesthetic appreciation. Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was directly inspired by him. Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, the killer who makes a woman suit out of human skin, who is trying to transform himself, is the most explicit fictional reckoning with what Gein was actually attempting to do, psychologically. Ed Gein, the man himself, almost certainly never knew about most of this. He did not read reviews. He was an elderly man in a psychiatric hospital, watching nature documentaries. At Mendota, Gein lived out the rest of his life in a quiet institutional routine. He was not, by the consistent testimony of staff who worked with him, a difficult patient. He was cooperative, almost deferential. He had preferences. He liked certain television programs. He liked to be outdoors when the weather permitted. He liked to talk with staff who would engage with him, but he pressed none of them. He accepted the structure of institutional life with the same passive accommodation he had accepted Augusta's structure decades before. He spoke about Augusta sometimes. Not always with the tortured ambivalence one might expect, but sometimes with what seemed like straightforward fondness. He missed her. He had loved her. The fact that she had also fundamentally destroyed him was not something he appeared to have any framework for analyzing. He spoke about Bernice Worden's with more evident discomfort. He said he was sorry. Whether that sorrow was for her family, or for the trouble his actions had caused, it is impossible to say with certainty. He was not a man with reliable access to his own interior. Staff at Mendota recalled that in his later years, as his health declined, Gein became quieter still. He developed cancer, respiratory failure and a brain tumor were ultimately listed as contributing causes of death. He stopped initiating conversations. He sat and looked out the windows. He was not obviously suffering. He seemed, in the way of very old or very ill people who have made some private accommodation with their circumstances, simply absent. Edward Theodore Gein died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. He died in the care of the state of Wisconsin, at Mendota Mental Health Institute. He had been institutionalized for all but 12 days of the previous 27 years. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, the same cemetery from which he had exhumed bodies 4 decades earlier. The grave marker was stolen several times over the years by collectors of the macabre. Eventually the remaining stone was removed by the cemetery and the grave left unmarked. There is a question that lingers over the Ed Gein case that no amount of forensic analysis, no psychiatric report, no cultural retrospective fully resolves. Why do we keep returning to him? Part of the answer is obvious and ungenerous. He is a figure of extreme horror, and extreme horror attracts attention. The human nervous system is wired for threat detection, the truly monstrous commands a kind of compulsory attention the way a car crash does. We look because we cannot not look. But there is something more than that. Gein troubles us in a way that is less about shock and more about recognition, the terrifying recognition that the mechanisms that failed so catastrophically in him are not entirely alien to the human experience. The need for a mother. The formation of identity through attachment. The substitution of symbolic objects for unbearable absence. The way grief can curdle, given the right conditions, into something that no longer resembles grief at all. Augusta Gein is the figure who haunts the Gein story in ways that are underexplored. She was not a killer. She broke no laws. She was, in the formal sense, just a deeply religious woman who raised her children on a farm in Wisconsin. And yet she engineered, with what degree of intentionality we can never know, a child who had no self, no boundaries, no resources for navigating a world beyond her. She made him need her in a way that could not survive her death with anything intact. The monster in the farmhouse had a mother. An understanding that is uncomfortable in ways that pure horror never is. This is not an exculpation. Ed Gein killed people. He violated the bodies of the dead on a scale that defies easy description. He caused specific, irreversible suffering to specific families and to an entire small community. The accounting of what he did cannot be softened by psychological context. But the context matters, because the context is the point. We have spent 65 years making movies and writing novels and recording true crime podcasts about Ed Gein, and the through line of all of it is not the gore, it is the question of how. How does a person become this? How does a child grow into a man who does these things in silence, in the dark, while also helping the neighbors, while also babysitting the children? The answer is slow. It is patient. It is made of small silences and unchallenged assumptions and doors closed on rooms that should have been opened. It is made of a child who had no one to tell him that the world outside his mother was not poison. It is made of a grief with no language and a desire with no name. None of which explains it entirely. Some things resist complete explanation. But the attempt to explain, the refusal to be satisfied with simply calling it evil and moving on, may be the most human thing we can do with a story like this one. The house is gone now. The grave is unmarked. Plainfield has mostly moved on, or learned to present a face that looks like it has. The snow falls on the empty lot where the farmhouse stood every winter, and covers everything for a while, and then melts, and the ground is bare again. Some things don't stay buried. That much, at least, Ed Gein taught us.